Thanks very much, Karis. So today I'd like to quickly take you through some of the changes we've been working on now for 2 years to implement some enhancements to the routine evaluations. I'd just like to firstly mention that some of the work that I'll be talking about today is really a function of a collaborative effort between AGBU, some other scientists, and including the sheep CRC as well as MLA and sheep genetics. And I think it's been what I'm talking about today has been a good outcome of a long-term effort by a lot of people. So I think it's a good result. So the outline of what I'd like to go through today is in 3 main areas. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the R&D and the changes we've made to the analysis, and then I'd like to just summarise the impact in terms of the breeding values and how much they might change, and finally just touch on some of the R&D we're working on now and some of the things that we can see that we'll be working on in the short term in the future. So as a summary of what's actually being changed in analysis, there's 3 main things that we've been working on. And the first is our full implementation of SingleStep and using genomics in our main analysis, and that really applies to the 3 major breeds, but not so much the smaller breeds. The second thing is a new version of parts of our OVA software, which we use to produce the breeding values, and we've implemented that across all our analyses. And the third thing is some changes to the data we're using our reproduction analyses, and again that only applies to our Australian analyses, and I'll touch more on that. So to talk about SingleStep to start with, so I use the term SingleStep, which is used by most researchers, but what it essentially means is using the genomic information at the same time as all our traditional pedigree and performance information. Up to now, for most of our traits, we've been actually blending breeding values. So essentially to do that, we've been using our breeding values that we routinely produce using our on-farm data and performance records, and independently of that we produce what we call a GBV, which is essentially a genomic EBV, using our reference population and all the genomic information. So we take that breeding value and blend them together based on how accurate we think that is. So we use that GBV and test it against some independent industry size, work out how valuable it is to predict progeny performance, and use that to blend our breeding value. So that's how we've been doing it for several years now for most of our key traits. So when we go to a SingleStep analysis, we essentially do everything at the same time in one step, and that's why we call it SingleStep. We take the phenotypic on-farm data and pedigree records, we take the genomic information and also the reference data, which can be both on-farm and in our research flocks, and analyse them simultaneously to produce a breeding value, which we believe is much more efficient use of all our data in front of us. And I'll talk more about why that is more efficient from an analysis point of view. So the main reasons we like to do that, or we see the benefits of doing that, is because it's using all the information at once. We don't need to do that extra blending step, which is suboptimal. And essentially, by doing SingleStep, we can use the actual genomic prediction for each animal, which is related to the genomic relationship to the animals with both genotypes and phenotypes, which we often call our reference population. So to do our current blending, we essentially have to assume a standard accuracy across each population, but that accuracy is actually not the same for all individuals, whereas in SingleStep, that's intrinsic in the analysis. We also can use the genomic information for all traits. At the moment, we're only blending for a certain subset of traits where we can see that there's clear benefits, and in SingleStep, essentially, the genomic information is used for every trait. Using our SingleStep analysis also allows the information to flow through the pedigree. So both ancestors and descendants of genotype animals get some benefits from the genomic information, which they don't in our blending approach. And another key aspect of SingleStep is it means that all our industry animals that have phenotypes and genotypes contribute to our reference. So in our current approach of blending, we only are using essentially the research population, which have the genotypes and phenotypes as our reference. So in some cases, that's a very important aspect of SingleStep, and breeders that have been doing lots of genotyping and phenotyping contribute to being their own reference, and that's an important step going forward, I think. So as I mentioned, we had to develop a new core part of our OVA software, and that's our solver. Essentially, when we tested SingleStep in our main Moreno run early last year, essentially was taking something like 10 days to solve the Moreno analysis, which was obviously just too long. So it was pretty clear to us that we needed to do something better. So for a while we've been working with a few colleagues in AGBU to develop better software to do this more efficiently. And now we've been able to get our routine analysis with SingleStep turned on down to a similar time to what they're taking now. So that's been a big achievement, and one of the main reasons we've been able to do that is better use of the computer technology that we've got in front of us, using our multi-processing machines better, and also using the memory in those machines more efficiently as well. And going forward, that software will give us better ability to fit different models and more advanced models in the future as well. And we've done a lot of testing of that new software to show that it produces equivalent results to the software we were using. So that's been a key outcome for us, and will be very useful going forward for our sheep evaluations, but also what we do in other species as well. So in terms of which analyses we're going to implement these single-step analyses in, we have some sub-analyses which we are also going to use the genomic information in. Currently we're essentially trying to replicate what we do for blending, and we're using single-step for the same sort of trait groups. So that means for the main analysis, obviously we'll use single-step, but we'll also use it for worm egg count analyses and also our visual trait analyses in Morenos. We won't be using it for reproduction just yet. We're still working on that, and I'll talk about what we're doing for reproduction towards the end of this talk. So, in summary of the impact, how that'll actually affect those analyses, which I'll go through in more detail, there's three key aspects, and because we're implementing our single-step analyses, we have to change the way we fit genetic groups in the model. That's a technical thing. I don't want to go into too much details, but it does have a small impact on how much change we'll see in our breeding values. Obviously, that influences that genomic information flowing through the pedigree, and also having more traits in those single-step analyses will influence how much breeding values change. And I'll talk more about those in a moment. I do want to comment on some restrictions. We've got a great diversity of breeds that have genotypes, but we're still maintaining our same philosophy there and still only using genotypes from the major breeds in each of those breed groups. So that hasn't changed. And it's important to consider how valuable a genomic test will be, and that'll still be determined in the same ways it has been for our blending, in that the genomic relationship to our reference or other animals with genotypes and phenotypes will influence how accurate that information is and how much it influences our breeding value. And also how much information animals already got in the system will influence how much the genomics contributes. And I'll touch more on those two issues just briefly as well. So this is a small example for yielding fibre diameter out of our Moreno analysis. Here we're looking at a range of flocks that have genotypes. Essentially on the x-axis we have the average relationship to our reference population, and on the y-axis we have the GEBV accuracy that we've been using. So there's a pretty clear relationship that if you're more related to the reference population, you'll get higher accuracy from your genomic information. But obviously even within any one of those flocks, there's variation in relationships to the reference population. So we expect to see, and you do see, variation between individuals within any one flock of how valuable that genomic information is to an individual's breeding value. So if we look at that in a bit more detail in practice, this is what we see from our analysis. I've just got here an example of adult clean fleece weight from our Moreno analysis. On the x-axis, we've got the accuracy from pedigree alone, or the normal analysis as it is now, compared to a single-step analysis. And you can see that obviously at the lower levels of accuracy, we get more information from including the genotypes in that analysis. And that's the sort of trend we expect to see. It won't be the same for all traits. It'll depend on the underlying relationship to the reference, obviously, and the accuracy of prediction from the genomic information. But essentially, the benefits of using genomics is higher at lower accuracies. So, just to touch more on the value of genomic information, it's not just the accuracy figure that we're interested in; it's the breeding values as well, and that's can be just as important as the accuracy figure. So, it's particularly important for traits where we've got antagonistic relationships and we're trying to breed in opposite directions. Just as an example, fleece weight and fibre diameter merinos are negatively correlated. So if we selected for fleece weight and didn't measure fibre diameter, we'd have no power to control that relationship and fibre diameter would go up. However, if we measure both traits, we can actually breed for higher fleece weight and lower fibre diameter, which has been done very well for a large number of years now. The same thing occurs for early growth and later growth and lean meat and eating quality. The difference with lean meat and eating quality, for example, is that we can't measure it directly ourselves, so we're relying on the genomic information to give us the ability to find animals that break that relationship. We often call them correlation breakers, but essentially we're trying to find animals that do something different to average. If we look at a small example of that, here I've got two flocks. The breeding values on x-axis, we've got lean meat yield. On the y-axis, we've got shear force. So on average, there's a relationship between those two traits. The blue flock is a flock that doesn't have as many measurements, doesn't have very many genotypes, and doesn't have as deep a pedigree and quality of recording over time. Whereas the red flock has lots more information, good deep phenotypes and pedigree, and lots of genotypes. So we can see that we can find animals that actually are deviating from average and are good for lean meat yield and also okay for shear force. And that's where the power of the genomic information comes in here to give us that ability to find animals that do break that average relationship. And if we look at some results from our Moreno Select SingleStep analysis and compare animals that were blended before and are now coming from the SingleStep analysis, if we look at the non-genotyped animals for starters, we can see that on average that 2016 drop are going up by 1 or 2%. That's the flow-on effect of those genotyped animals flowing through the pedigree, up and down the pedigree to animals that aren't genotyped. It's small but significant. These animals have already got moderate accuracies, so we see less effect of that compared to if they had low accuracies. If we then go on to look at the genotyped animals, in this case we can see that the accuracies are 60-odd% for those fleece traits, obviously a bit higher, and if we compare those to the blended breeding values, some are going up on average and some are going down. And essentially that is one of the benefits I see of using SingleStep, in that we're using actual relationship to the reference to determine our benefits in terms of our genomic prediction. Instead of using a population-wide value, which might be too high or too low, for these 158 animals, they might be a bit more lowly rated to the reference, and in most cases, the accuracy coming out of the SingleStep analysis has actually gone down slightly. But in some cases, we can see it's actually gone up, and that's the sort of thing that we expect to see from this change. The other thing to note from this table is that if we compare the SingleStep results for ungenotyped animals to genotyped animals, on average we're seeing about, say, a 15 to 20% increase in accuracy from genotyping. Remembering that these animals have a starting accuracy of about 40% or 50%, so they're already starting from moderate accuracy, so we don't expect to see a massive benefit, but for these traits, the 2016 drop animals are obviously getting a significant benefit from using that genomic information for a late in life trait. If we look at that increase in the non-genotyped animals a little bit more, this just shows the old accuracy compared to the new SingleStep accuracy for the ungenotyped animals. So this is just highlighting that flow-on effect of the genotype animals flowing through up and down the pedigree and having an influence on the accuracy of the ungenotyped animals. On average, it's not very big. It's only that 1 or 2% that I mentioned. But for adult clean fleece weight, some animals are going up by 10 or 15% in accuracy. So that is a significant change for some of those animals. Another thing we've done as part of the development of the SingleStep analysis is actually look at how well our EBVs, both our SingleStep single trait EBVs that Hamish mentioned before, as well as our blended RBVs, essentially were how useful they were and how they've changed now compared to our SingleStep analysis. I guess the summary is that they did work very well, and they are quite well related, but we don't expect them to be the same thing because they were quite different analyses. They were SingleStep analyses, and they are also that GBU analysis that I mentioned before was quite different because of the animals that were in it and also the way it was done. And also in SingleStep, we're using a lot more information. I've just got a quick summary of how that they actually compared. If you look at the maternals, in the top 2 rows, there's just 2 traits and example traits: adult weight and post-weaning eye muscle depth for a couple of different groups of animals. The first column is the progeny born in INF. The second column is INF size. Then we've got a group of industry size and that have been industry animals that have been genotyped, and the validation size or industry size that have been genotyped. But the summary is that those correlations between what we were doing and what we are doing for those genotyped animals are quite high. So that's a good outcome, and the same can be seen for those other Moreno and maternal examples. So just to finish up about our single-step development, essentially I think it's important to take stock of where we've got to. We've been sort of working on incorporating genomics into our routine evaluations for a long time now with a large number of people, and I think it's a good outcome for sheep genetics that we've got to where we are. Our analyses are quite complicated, some quite large, multi-breed analyses with up to 3 million animals and 76 traits now, and in some cases, like the Moreno analysis, has a large number of genetic groups which we have to fit, and we've also now got a significant number of genotypes. So I think it's definitely a world-leading achievement. I'm not saying it's a world first, but I think we're up there with in terms of what's going on across the world, and definitely making good use of our genomic information into our routine evaluations. So finally, I'd just like to touch on, in terms of SingleStep, some of the validation work that's been done and going on to show that our SingleStep breeding values are doing something better than what we have been doing in the past. So Andrew Swan's done some validation work, which I'll talk about briefly now. He'll also talk tomorrow about some of the work with eating quality, which I think is another good example of how our analysis developments are producing better breeding values. And as we speak, there's more work going on at AGBU to actually do extensive validation of our new analysis and make sure that we're producing breeding values that predict progeny performance better than what they were. So we'll talk more about that as that work comes out. So just as a very small example, Andrew's looked at our single trait analysis, our prediction from a normal pedigree BLUP, which is a BLUP column, to a single-step analysis. And for those standard production traits, we can see a pretty clear benefit from using that genomic information to predict progeny performance. And that essentially that values the accuracy of that genomic prediction, and is a clear improvement for all those traits. If we look at the carcass and eating quality traits, we see a similar story. If we compare our normal pedigree BLUP to using a single-step model, we see clear benefits in prediction of progeny performance. So we'll do lots more work on this to make sure that we're doing a better job across the board. But the summary is essentially, what I've just said, that we get clear benefits in terms of prediction of progeny performance from using our single-step over our traditional pedigree BLUP, and our breeding values that we're producing now from single-step are doing a very similar job to what our blending breeding values were doing in the past. So I just want to move on now to talk about some of the changes to the reproduction data. Over the last 12 months, we've identified that there's some data in our analyses, particularly for number lambs weaned, that's not as accurate as we'd like, and that's around the survival rates of twins. And we're seeing that there's a proportion of data in our analyses where we're getting 100% survival of twins, which we don't believe, and we don't believe that essentially survival information is being recorded well enough in those flocks, so we're not going to use the number of lambs weaned information in the analysis anymore. So we'll still use the number of lambs born, but we won't use that survival bit which is in number of lambs weaned. So I think it's important for breeders to be aware of that, and we need to work with those breeders and make sure that the data is being collected adequately there so we can use that information. We've also done some work to pull in the INF and resource flock information, in particular the INF followers, where we've had daughters of all those key size have had several reproduction records now, and we've pulled that data into our analyses, which will have a small effect in some of the runs, which I'll summarise quickly. So essentially here I've just summarised the reproduction data that we're using in each of those key analyses, the number of flocks, and then how much INF data we've added. So it's really only going to have impact in Merinos, but there are a small number of records coming in from INF now in the maternal analysis and also in the SAM analysis. The bigger issue is that 100% survival in twins. There's a number of flocks. In all analyses there's several flocks, and up to say about a 5% reduction in the number of Lamb-Sween phenotypes. So that is a significant issue, and I think we need to address that as much as we can going forward, but at the moment those records are not going to be used until we fix up the data. So now I'd like to change tack a little bit and talk more about changes in breeding values. So as a result of those three key changes to the analysis, we will see some change in breeding values, but that'll affect different breeds and different traits in different ways. So I'll touch on a summary of those across the three major breed groups. So if we look at the Merinos first, if we look at the genetic trends for index, for simplicity, we see very similar genetic trends, so we don't expect to see many changes in trends across any of the analyses. We do see a little bit more trend because we're including more reference data in that analysis now, and also the use of genomic information has given us a little bit more trend, so we might see a bit of an increase on average in some of the indexes. If we look at the ranking of flocks across those analyses, we do expect to see some small changes across the three indexes. The changes are not big, but there is some re-ranking that is occurring. On the x-axis we have the current routine analysis from mid-January compared to our new analysis. So we do see some small changes in the ranking, but they're not massive by any means. I also pulled out the top 150 sires to look at those. I've just got the Moreno MP Plus index on the graph. I don't know if you can see the colours very well, but essentially the orange dots are ungenotyped animals and the blue dots are genotyped animals. So out of those top 150 animals, there's not a massive change, but some animals, but particularly those with genotypes, will see some re-ranking, but essentially the top 150 are the same in both analyses. If we look at the terminal analysis, essentially the genetic trends are very similar for those three indexes, similar to what we've seen in the Moreno example. If we look at the ranking of flocks for Carcass Plus and Lamb 2020 across the board, we do not see much change at all. We do see a bit more change in eating quality index, that's EQ index, sorry. Because we're actually producing a lot more breeding values now, we've included the eating quality data in the main analysis. We're actually producing more flocks are getting breeding values for eating quality and changing that index than what we had in the past. Again, if we pull out the top 150 sires and look at their ranking for EQ, because most of those key sires are in the top on that index, most sires haven't changed very much because they're all in the carcass analysis where we already had SingleStep implemented last year. So there's not much change for those. We do see more change if we look at Lamb 2020. Again, on that graph, the blue dots are the genotyped animals. The ungenotyped animals are the orange dots, and they're not changing very much. But we do see more re-ranking for the genotyped animals because there's more genomic information being used, there's more data and analysis, and that's flowing through the pedigree and being used a lot more. And the same story can be seen for Carcass Plus. Same reasons as I mentioned before. So if we look at maternal genetic trends, again, they're not going to change across the board. We don't expect to see many differences there for the key traits and the indexes. We do see a bit of change for fatness, which I thought was important to talk about. The trends change for fat in the maternals. That's a function of three key things. The comment I made about fitting genetic groups has had an influence on fatness in maternals because we're fitting the genetic groups in a slightly different way. The other thing is that the inclusion of the reference data, so that's the eating quality and yield data out of the INF, is now going into that main analysis for more traits and more animals, and that's having an influence on the maternal, and also the genomic information is having an influence on the trend as well. So that's threefold. So that will influence the fat breeding values in maternals a little bit more than what we've seen in the other breeds. A similar story for the ranking of flocks. The flock means for the three key indexes are pretty similar between the new and the old analysis. If we look at the flock means for fatness, we do see a bit more change because of those reasons I've just explained for post-weaning fat. And finally, the top 150 size on BLX in this case shows a similar story to what we've seen before. There's not as many animals, not as many blue dots, not as many animals genotyped, and we see a few more animals changing for the ungenotyped animals because of that fat issue that I mentioned before. So just quickly to touch on the SAMS and Dooney analyses, essentially we don't see as many changes. The results from the new and old analysis are quite similar except for the impact of that reproduction change that I mentioned. Because we're taking out the flock drops with 100% twin survival and adding the reproduction data from INF, we do see some changes for reproduction. But outside those traits, we don't see many changes for those analyses. So I'd just like to touch on some of the current work that we're doing and some of the future R&D that we can see on the horizon. One of the key things that we've been working on now for some time is our enhanced reproduction analysis. We've already started testing this analysis, but we've just got a few refinements to make before we actually release breeding values from it. So there's a couple of key things that we actually want to implement in this new analysis. We want to break the net reproduction rate, so number of lambs born and weaned, down into its components. So that's fertility, litter size and ewe rearing ability. So we want to analyse them as separate traits so we can use the data we've got provided by breeders better and also fit better models or more appropriate models to each component trait rather than the single trait. We are going to use a single-step analysis, so where we've got the reference animals and also the industry animals with genotypes and phenotypes, we'll make use of all that in those analyses. And then we also want to include more correlated traits, particularly in the Moreno analysis. There's some key traits like wrinkle and face cover that are correlated to reproduction. But for the other analyses, traits like fat and muscle and condition score and also maternal behaviour score have been shown to be related to reproduction. So we want to make use of that information and try and produce more reliable breeding values for reproduction traits. And so our plan is at the moment to produce RBVs for these traits as soon as we're able to get that analysis bedded down. And again, we want to do some validation work to show that these breeding values predict progeny performance better. So we hope that to come out during the year for people to get a feel for what they look like and give us some feedback about those new breeding values. Some of the work that we're working on now and need to work on in the future is around using genomic information better in our analyses. One of the key things that we need to resolve is how to include genomic information from non-sheep genetics flocks. At the moment, we rely on the sheep genetics information, essentially the standard pedigree and performance records to predict our base merit of our flocks. So in the terminal and maternal case, that's our breed effects, and in Merinos, that's our flock differences. We're working with the sheep CRC to develop ways of including the non-genotyped animals in that single-step analysis so we can actually do that better. There's also a range of things we're doing in our single-step analysis that we want to do more work on and make sure we've got the right assumptions. For example, when we're doing our single-step analysis, we have to essentially weight the pedigree and the genomic information together somehow. Pardon me. And we've already done a lot of work on that, but I think there's much more work to do to work out how best to do that and how to weight that across the various traits and analyses that we need to deal with. We also would like to use our genomic information to better inform our genetic groups. Essentially, at the moment, we don't use it at all, but it's been shown that we can predict things like breed and also flock differences from our genomic information, and we want to use that directly in our analysis to deal with our genetic group differences better. We've also seen that there is some inconsistencies between our pedigree and our genotypic information. Sometimes we go from having no pedigree to having pedigree. In other cases, we have inconsistent pedigree where the pedigree looks different. And so we need a way to work out which things we need to account for and deal with in analysis, but we also need a system within sheep genetics to be able to deal with those inconsistencies. If a pedigree is clearly different, what we're going to need to try find a way to work out why it's different and how we actually remove that inconsistency in our analysis. We also want to investigate a range of alternate models. There's work being done across the world looking at other ways to include genomic information and, for example, sequence data and things like that. So we need to keep abreast of that and work out the best way to be using genomics in our analyses. We're also aware that there's a big diversity of breeds in the sheep industry, and we want to be working with the smaller breeds and working out how we can actually best use the genomic information in our single-step analysis as well for those smaller breeds. We've also got some work ahead of us to use our data better. I feel breeders are able to record more weights and more information on animals, and a lot of that's being underutilised. And I'd like to see us change the way we analyse the data and actually look at using all our weight records, for example, in a more useful manner. Especially with the need in some breeds to bend growth curves, I think we need to be able to make that system easier for breeders and make better use of those weight records. We also want to do more work around breeding objectives and make sure that our breeding objectives are appropriate for each production system and make sure that we're capturing all the traits that are important to us. So just to start wrapping up, essentially the last 2 years have been focused on delivering more accurate breeding values and breeding values that predict progeny performance better. This analysis change will have some significant impacts, particularly animals that are genotyped, and we're happy to have as much feedback as we can from breeders. As the results come online, feel free to contact Sheep Genetics and us so we can actually diagnose any changes in breeding values and making sure our analyses are getting those breeding values as best as we can. I do want to highlight reproduction data again. I seem to be saying this quite regularly, but we're still lacking good reproduction data through our mating module, where we've got joining information, things like preg scan and adult weights. We want to use that information, and it's very important for us to get that mating data, develop that new reproduction analysis that I was mentioning, and also pregnancy scanning data. I think there's lots of pregnancy scanning data being recorded in industry that we can use in our analyses right now that's not being supplied to us. So that's just a couple of things that I think there's a good opportunity to get that data in and we can make use of that. And essentially our ongoing R&D will simply be doing more of the same and trying to produce more accurate breeding values for a greater range of traits. Thank you.
Great, thanks Daniel. I think it's ridiculously cool what you guys are doing up at AGBU, and it's a massive achievement, so congratulations to you and everyone else about SingleStep. I think Richard Apps, he summarised it pretty well the other day. He said, if you look at the evolution that we've made around our genetic evaluation, from doing it within flock to then shifting to a crossbreed, across flocks to a crossbreed, single-step carcass to now, it's a significant step. Are you confident that the step is going to actually improve the rates of gain that people in the room here today can make?
Yeah, I think there's lots of opportunities, and other speakers will talk more about that, and especially if you think about what the future might look like. I think there's some of the things that we just spoke about will become more important into the future, but every time we make a change, we do a lot of work to test and make sure that we're actually doing something better than what we're doing before, but it's still reliant on the quality of the data recorded and provided on farm, and I think there's lots of opportunities and lots of diversities across the data we deal with to do better, but I think there's definitely evidence there to show that each time we're making these enhancements, we're producing breeding values that do a better job of predicting progeny performance.
Daniel, is the mating weight of the ewe used in creating the adult weight for the ewe within the database? It's the same measurement going into the both fields.
Yeah, at the moment we're not using the joining weight in the mating module. That's our intention, is to do that, but we're not getting enough data supplied by breeders in the mating module yet to actually turn that on. So we're still using the adult weights that come through the system. But we want to replace, we want to take the mating weight out of the mating module and use it as an adult record in our analysis.
Daniel, given that 28 of the 133 maternal flocks are putting rubbish into the number of lambs weaned, and you're now going to remove that. What effect is that going to have to both accuracy and the breeding values for those flocks that are doing the right thing?
The 28 flocks were affected by that. That means that at least one of their flock years was removed. Across the board, there's only like 5 or, I can't remember the number for maternals, 5 or 10% of records being removed for number of lambs weaned. It'll have a minimal impact on other flocks is the bottom line.
So that's 28 flocks over a few years?
Yeah, at least 1 year out has been affected for each of those 28 flocks.
Thanks, Daniel. I feel a bit like Oliver. Is there more? It's great, the progress we're making. We're getting closest to that, I guess, holy grail of a cross-breed analysis with all of this and everything else, where post-weaning weight is relative between the Morenos, the maternals and the terminals, and we can really judge all the different breeds and different things in that single analysis.
Technically, we could probably do it. We're not ready to do it. I don't think we've got to question how valuable it would be to do them all together. But there's a few key differences between our assumptions in terms of our genetic parameters, our correlations, heritabilities and adjustment factors that are different between those breeds. And we need to deal with those differences properly in that combined analysis. And that's something we want to work on just within the terminals and the maternal analyses now. But I don't think we're at the stage we can be putting it all into one analysis, because it'll take too long and be too big for not enough benefit is probably my feeling. But I'd be interested to know from an industry point of view how high a priority that should be. But I know that technically speaking, we've got a lot of work to do before we could do that, to make sure we're doing making our assumptions within our analysis correct, let alone things like linkage and what have you.
Quick question, Daniel. Are you doing any work on body condition score?
Not enough. We're trying to encourage breeders to give us more data so we can do more on industry data work on that. But it's definitely a high priority for us to understand both its value in the breeding objective and interaction with production systems, as well as producing a breeding value and maybe including it in those indexes. But at the moment, we're not using it at all. But we'd like to be able to do the work to know how to include it and definitely produce a breeding value for it.